I am here with Enrique García, who's going to talk with us about Latinx film and comics. Enrique is chair now of Luso Hispanic Studies at Middlebury College. Welcome, Enrique.
Oh, hi. I'm very glad to be here. It's an honor to be invited.
I love having you. I love your work, Enrique. This is a question I have. I don't think we've ever sort of gone back this far in your biography and your journey, but how did you get into comic studies? Like, what was the thing that like got you here? And, you're doing all this amazing work.
Well, the first thing is that before I became a professor, first I was a comic book geek. So I began reading comic books when I was in third grade, and I have been collecting since then. So which means that I have a big comic book collection that ranges from American comics, Latin American comic books, Japanese comic books, etc. What I wanted to mention briefly is that the first comics I read in Puerto Rico were from Mexico, because in the early 1980s, the Puerto Rican newspaper industry kind of replicated what was done in Mexico, where a lot of the comic books were published by the newspaper companies. So therefore, they were importing a lot of the Mexican comic books like Memin Penguin, Kaliman, Águila Solitaria, Samurai, etc. And then for me as a third grader, it was easier to read those because they were in Spanish. And then also they were cheaper than the American comic books because they only cost 25 cents. So therefore with $2 American, I could buy 8 comic books a week, which it was cheaper than the American comic books at the time. But that industry collapsed when the Mexican comic book industry collapsed in the late 80s. So therefore in the 90s, the comic book stores arrived in Puerto Rico throughout the island. And that's when somehow the reading habits of the Puerto Ricans became more American. So they were reading superheroes, etc. So when I went to the university, in the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, I did a bachelor in comparative literature, and it was a conservative program in general. So we were doing like literature mostly. So I couldn't actually use my comic book knowledge for my research at that time. But then when I went to grad school in UMass Amherst, in the big public school, it was at the time that the 5-college area in Amherst, Northampton, etc., Kitchen Sink was operating in Northampton. They had a big museum. They had like 3 comic book stores. And then suddenly when I arrived to my comparative literature program, there was even a professor that his name is Chris Couch. I actually was able to be his teaching assistant. So suddenly I felt legitimized because I was always thinking, oh, it's possible that I may never be able to use my comic book knowledge somehow in a scholarly way. But then my program somehow, by luck, was connected to the comic book narratives. And then I was able to write articles about Mexican comics, etc. And it was luck because I could have gone to another program and maybe that other program wouldn't do comic books. So it worked out for all of us because they were like, oh, we have a grad student that does comic book. Cool.
Remarkable. I love it. I didn't know that story, Enrique. Thank you for sharing. And of course, this has led to a lot of research and writing, including publication of several books. Why write and research on Latinx comics and film? I mean, there's a lot of comics you could write on. There's a lot of film you could write on. Why focus on Latinx?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. My approach changed when I moved to the US because I think when you are raised in Puerto Rico, the island, somehow your point of view is more Latin American because that's how the education system is organized there. So when I moved to the US is where I began to understand how Latinx culture works, Latinx from the United States. And so if you kind of like look at my curriculum vitae, the first articles I wrote were about Mexican comics from Mexico, because it's obvious that I was still focusing on Latin American nation states. And then when my first book is about Cuban cinema, so again, it's about an island in the Caribbean. So then as I began to teach more in the US and I was more in contact with the Latinx student, and then I began to envision myself as Latinx, then my research shifted to a Latinx content. Now, what I have been doing in my research, which hopefully I can expand later when I talk about my forthcoming book about Puerto Rico and the superheroes, is that I feel that in the Latinx studies field, more writing should be about how we are connected to Latin America. And how, you know, we have this transnational culture that somehow is compatible and different at the same time. And so, again, one of my goals is to develop Latinx research, as I'm doing, but also establish those connections to the other Latin American nation states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so important, that hemispheric, the island bridge, right? The hemispheric Americas and the interconnection there culturally in and through comics and film. Enrique, what is the vision and approach? I mean, we've just kind of started to get into this. It's the vision and approach as a trans-hemispheric or hemispheric, but can you kind of drill down a little more?
Well, I think I am a little different, I guess, to other scholars, because also I wasn't formed in an English or Spanish department. So therefore, my focus is not language. Like I don't define narratives necessarily, oh, this is what I study because it's in English, or this is what I study because it's in Spanish. So because I was doing comparative literature, I was able to expand my research to also cover Asia, Europe, Africa, etc. And so my vision in comics and pop culture is that I cannot limit my research, even if I'm doing Latinx or if I'm doing Caribbean, just to those geographies, because usually when you talk about movies and comic books, the intertextual connections are way bigger than that. And so, for example, one example that I can give you, when I'm researching my book about Puerto Rico and the superheroes, I realized, for example, that the influences of Asian comic books in Latinx authors, and especially Puerto Ricans in New York, is very big. And then when I go to the Puerto Rico Comic Convention, you can see that all the Puerto Ricans, a lot of them are doing cosplay of anime and manga, etc. So for me to understand some of the Puerto Rican comic book art, I need to also know how Japanese comic books work. I cannot just say, oh, I'm analyzing this from a Hispanic perspective or from an American perspective. I need to understand how the aesthetics of manga and anime work in that sense. So again, I focus on certain geographies, but I feel that I need to be able to know how it works in other geographies that are also influential in Latinx and Hispanic culture.
I love that. Is Enrique, not to put you on the spot here, but would you go so far as to say that comics have a third language?
In what sense?
In the sense, I'm thinking here, you know, we have the verbal, and not always, and to different degrees of presence. And of course, we have the dominant as the visual. But I'm wondering if, in fact, the language of comics is somehow a third language, and that language is a transnational language.
Yeah. And that's something that is important sometimes to teach the students, because, for example, when I teach my comic book classes in the Spanish department, the students assume that they are going to understand the comic just because they know Spanish, because of course the infrastructure of the university says you have to know this amount of Spanish to take the class. But I have students that are great in Spanish, like they know the language and they can understand a complex book written in Spanish, but they don't know how to read a comic book. So sometimes they don't even know how to follow the different drawings. They're like, do you read from left to right, etc. And so then other students whose language may be more limited actually understand how the graphic narrative works. See what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
so,
No,
so that's why they all have like their little quirks and issues.
yeah.
And then sometimes I'm teaching the students Hispanic or Latinx or Latin American comic books, and they don't even understand how the American culture influences those comics because they haven't even read their own comics. So for example, when I teach my superhero parodies class, they haven't read Batman and they haven't read Superman. So then when I teach them how Condorito parodies Batman, I also have to explain to them how Batman functions. So for example, if Condorito has a car, a Batman car, and the Batman car doesn't work fine because it's supposed to be like a poor Batman's car. A lot of the students don't get that the visual parody is saying, oh, you usually assume that the Batman car is top notch and that it represents American industrialization, etc. But the comic doesn't say it. You just know by seeing that the Condorito car is terrible. So that's why it's a mixture of understanding the aesthetic, understanding references that are not there, plus the languages.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a third language. It's a teaching a third language. So Cuban cine, tell us in a kind of elevator pitch version, because I know it's rich and there's a long history, but for folks that don't understand, Cuban cinema, can you share some insights?
Well, in a summarized way, the reason I found Cuban cinema interesting is because the Caribbean cinema industry hasn't been well developed. Like, sometimes we get some movies from time to time. Right now, the Dominican Republic is doing a lot of movies. Cuba is also doing a lot of movies. But practically, after the revolution, Cuba was the one who was able to establish an industry that was stable, that somehow was able to fight off how capitalism usually destroys national cinema because everyone watches Hollywood at the end. Now, Cuba had a big industry before the revolution, but it was kind of like serving global American standards of musicals, etc. And so then the Cuban cinema practically became a political cinema in the 60s. So it was the main inspiration for a lot of the Latin American left because it was the territory where you could make a leftist narrative in the 60s and 70s, while a lot of the Latin American countries had become right-wing dictatorships. So that's the particular history that people sometimes don't remember. That's why Cuban cinema was important at the time, because it was like a safe haven for intellectuals to escape, to do this type of movies, etc. Now, after the Cold War, which is what my book focuses on, after the Soviet Union collapse, a lot of the Marxist ideology that was glorified, kind of like lost its glamour because people were saying, look, it didn't work in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, Cuba is very poor. So practically they had to redefine their movies to kind of like please the new market that was getting into more like the neoliberal phase. One of the things that I mentioned in the book is that they were able to shift to this new type of entertainment cinema instead of like the didactic one they had before. But there are some issues, like now that they get financing from Spain and from other European countries, then they had to please the European market. So then somehow some sort of exploitation comes back. So even though they still do political movies, you can see that they have to include sex scenes and music, which is what foreigners like. So right now they're trying to balance like this idea. People know us because of the sexuality and the music, but also because of the politics. So we need to do political movies that are sexy and musical in a way.
Wow. Where does I know you've done work on Juan of the Dead. Where does that fall into all of this?
Well, Juan of the Dead kind of falls in the sense that they're trying to do a genre that foreign markets like, because who doesn't like zombie movies? At the same time, the movie has some interesting political dynamics. So it's not that, zombie movies tend to have some political infrastructure, which I think the One of the Dead does. But the movie also parodies a lot of the things that happened to Cuba in the 90s. So that's why I don't know if you remember the movie. Practically what the movie is saying is the zombie apocalypse is just another phase, like the phase we had in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed and we didn't have food. So for them it's normal. And usually zombie movies are about the trauma of capitalist civilization suddenly finding themselves without their resources. So the Cubans are practically making fun of the other country, saying, "Oh, you think you had it bad? Like we always had it like this." So we just survived. Which is what I thought it was brilliant in a way.
I love that movie. La Llorona is something that you've written, the new La Llorona on, and bringing your kind of approach and interest and your political lens, as well as your very careful, close reading of film language. Can you share with us why La Llorona is interesting?
Well, usually Latin America has a subgenre of horror, which is the ghost political movie, where usually this type of movie is used to communicate how the national audience from that particular country still have issues with violence that happened in the past, either with the dictatorship or genocide, etc. So the Argentinians had a movie that is called The Appear, for example, where it's about, in Spanish, is Los Aparecidos, which is kind of like a twist on Desaparecidos, which is what happened in the 70s with the dictatorship. And so the Spanish have it also with their traumas with the Franco regime, etc. And so practically this movie is doing the same. So it's remaking the Llorona myth, but also for Guatemala, and to deal with what happened with the genocide against the indigenous communities. I really liked the movie because I saw that the characters of, even though the movie is about the white Guatemalan family, and it also portrays indigenous communities in a way that empowers them, because practically the way they push the family and the general with their protest is what actually leads to the political change of the movie. So it doesn't have, to me, in my opinion, like the condescending thing that happens sometimes in some of the Latin American movies, where they use the indigenous character as a prop about how the white family feels, in a way. I felt, I don't know if you have seen Roma.
Yep.
Like I felt that in Roma, even though it's a great movie, somehow the epiphany is only, to me, it was more about the white family, and I felt that in this movie is about the indigenous community. But also the white family has the epiphany too, I guess. But I thought it was a better balance between the white community and the indigenous community than in Roma, which maybe because the movie is from the point of view of Cuarón, as he's supposed to be represented with the kids, somehow it's more about his family, I thought, than the community.
Right. La Llorona. There was the Latinx US La Llorona that came out as well. I don't know if you saw that. but it builds itself on a kind of one version, I would say, of the myth of La Llorona, the drowning of the children to be with the lover. And I found that to be problematic, not because it's not one of the myths of La Llorona, but because it became the one that was made. And we haven't really seen at that point a range of the ways La Llorona has been in our lives and very complicated in different ways. And this movie and the way you articulate its kind of message is really remarkable. Enrique, tell me, if visual culture is obviously something very important to you and kind of analyzing and making us sort of understand and think about the ways we think about things through movies and comics. Tell me about this book, the Hernandez Brothers, Love, Rockets, and Alternative Comics.
Yeah, that was a book that I wrote for the Latin profiles in University of Pittsburgh Press. And so it was kind of difficult at first to organize because the Hernandez have a lot of material. So if I'm going to analyze every comic they have done, it would have been like some 2,000-page comic book. So what I did was more like try to write it in a way that it was accessible for the undergrads. So I selected some of the comic books that would kind of like explain some of the theoretical concepts that I wanted to explore. So practically I focus on some of the ideas of parody and intertextuality, but more like to put it from the perspective of an ethnic creator. What is it when you're reading in a comic made by an ethnic creator in the US or Latinx creator? How is it that you as a reader are able to interpret that particular narrative? Do you have all the tools? What is that narrative made of? Is it a mixture of the culture of the author, or is it like a mix with references to the mainstream? Can you even understand the comic even if you are a certain type of Latinx? Which is why in the introduction I say, well, I'm from Puerto Rico. I have lived in the last 20 years in the East Coast. So it's possible that I may not know some references about LA, like when they go to a certain club, maybe I don't know what that club is when the characters go there. But then I may get some references to Cantinflas and to other Mexican references that another Latinx will know. Also, what about gender? Does gender play a role into how you interpret that particular comic, etc.? So I was trying to also push against the idea of intertextuality, that the author is not important, which is what they call, they talk in the death of the author, because some of the people who write about people of color narratives, they feel that the authorship of the people of color is important in analyzing those particular signs that are completely mixed, etc. So practically in the book, I'm kind of like saying, if you're reading Los Bros, you may need to know how comic books function. You may need to know how alternative comic functions. You may need to know how the mainstream concepts of American comic books are appropriated and then put in their work. Also how the industry affects them, because just the fact that the industry can censor sometimes is in different ways how the product is portrayed. So therefore they have to actually work, in an independent setting. Sometimes readers don't know that. They assume, oh, this is the text, I'm reading it and that's it. But there are many factors that make their art work. It's not just the author, it's like their culture, the historical phase of the industry, etc.
So rich and such an important book. Enrique, thank you for the time and the work that you put into that. I know that, and you've mentioned this already, your new project and even a piece of this that you published in Graphic Indigeneity is really to kind of look at Puerto Rican history and even the Taíno cultural sort of histories and ancestry in its way, how it's woven itself in and through comics. Can you share some of that with us? I know you've already begun to share that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the research that I'm doing also, I have been very interested in how indigenous culture is portrayed in the different Latin American countries, because sometimes people throw the word indigenous, but it's obvious that the indigenous communities are different in the different Latin American states. So for example, the Caribbean used to have like a lot of Taíno influences, you know, the Central American influences are different, you know, with the Mayan, etc. And then in South America, they're different too, and they're different histories. So I have been reading on that, which may be a possible book in the future. But you know, for example, the way they represent indigenous communities in Mexican comic books is different to how they appear in Argentinian comic books, and there are different histories. So now in Puerto Rico, what I thought it was interesting was that the Taíno are very present in the Caribbean. Like you see books about them, they do children's books about them. The words are in there, the food. But usually, I don't know if it is because of the mestizaje, but they assume that they don't exist there anymore. So the governments have this idea like, oh, the Taínos don't exist anymore, as opposed to in Mexico where they have indigenous communities. Usually they assume that the identity in the Caribbean is gone, that people wouldn't say that it's Taíno, that you're just Cuban or Puerto Rican or Dominican. But then I realized that the Latinx in the US, a lot of the Puerto Rican Latinx were calling themselves Taíno or Afro-Taínex or something like that. And then I was like, interesting, because when I was in the island, they kept telling me that I couldn't be Taíno. that you have to be Puerto Rican, and maybe you can say that you're Black, but they were practically erasing that. But then at the same time, you can see that when you go to the Morro, the Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña has tons of Taíno books and merchandise and playing cards and coloring books, and so it's almost like if the Taínos are the Star Wars of the of the Puerto Rico government. So I was kind of like shocked about this. Like, why is the government telling me that I cannot be Taíno, but then at the same time selling so much stuff about Taíno? But then the ones in the US, they are in that space, the Puerto Ricans can call themselves Taíno. And so my article practically is trying to reconcile what is happening. Why is it that is happening? And actually, there are more connections between the government and what the Latinx are doing than people give it credit.
Really?
And so in the article, I was trying to say, look, the Taínos are there in the popular culture of Puerto Rico in the comics. And so my conclusion is that for the Latinx, the Taíno identity is a way of also escaping a Hispanic hegemony that is in the Caribbean that also can be oppressive, because sometimes people assume that it's only the Anglophone hegemony, but the authorities are Hispanic. So the Taínos are a way of saying, I have an identity that is not based on something that is institutionalized in the school. So you know, at the end of the article, I say that's fine. Like, it's up to the people to, you know, like my article was sort of like a process of self-discovery where I was trying to say, like I didn't know why are they calling themselves Taíno, but then now I understand. Like,
Yeah, really, really important work, Enrique, and resonates also with kind of official policy in places like Mexico, maybe less official policy here in the US, where kind of, you know, indigenous peoples have become, it's okay when they're in the movies as certain kinds of types. It's okay when you see kind of, you know, figurines, but it's not okay to actually create policy to sustain and nourish and grow these real living, breathing communities. Anyway, very, very important work.
Well,
I know it. Mhm.
can I just add something
Yeah,
brief?
yeah.
I just was teaching the Book of Life this week, the movie, which is a movie that I think is great, but it was interesting. One student was discussing about how even though it's a great movie as a Mexican product and it has like all the mestizaje and you can see the Mayan references, the student was asking me why somehow the main characters tilt toward being Spanish. And so you can see that they send the girl to study in Spain, like the characters that are dead have like Spanish costumes. And so then it kind of like made me think about it, and I was like, wow, it's true. Like, I don't think in the Book of Life you see indigenous people talking indigenous language. Like, somehow they are assimilated in the visuals.
I
Like you
hadn't.
guys, have you thought
Yeah.
about it that way?
No, I hadn't. That's really a remarkable insight.
Yeah, because she was saying, the student was saying, you can see the Mayan, you can see Xibalba there as a god, you can see the aesthetics, but you cannot see the indigenous people. And so I was there like, huh? And again, that's why one of the things that I like about Latinx culture, when going back to another question that you have, is that I think Latinx culture, one thing that I like is that sometimes Latin American nation states, the government control a lot of things that are happening in the narrative. So then policy affects how people perceive their identity. And so then sometimes we don't realize that there is a certain whiteness operating, in Mexico, in Puerto Rico, in Argentina, in Colombia, etc. And so I somehow feel that Latinx culture in the US sometimes is able to interact with other non-Eurocentric communities, and therefore they develop in different ways than the Latin American countries that have institutions safeguarding how we see that they should define their identity. So when you see Latinx comics, you can see that they're in New York or in LA, they're Hernandez, they have Japanese friends, they have, African American friends. So their ideology, to me personally, I think tends to be different in that sense.
Yeah,
And
a space of complexity and breathing, right? Yeah.
And so, for example, one of the things that I discovered in my research about the Puerto Rican comic book artists is that the ones in Puerto Rico, they see themselves limited to Puerto Rico. But then you see that the ones who are living in New York, they will work with Marvel and then do comics with Native American heroes, with African American heroes. So the concept of POC can transcend a particular Puerto Rican identity.
Love it. I love it, Enrique. Thank you. So insightful. You mentioned how the student kind of brought you to this awareness, and me right now. Tell me what's an Enrique Garcia trademark method for teaching comics or comic book films in your classroom?
Well, the problem sometimes with comic books is that they demand too much background. Like, not everyone is a geek that is reading since they're in third grade. Like, sometimes the students show up to the class and they say, I may have read one Tintin graphic novel. So it's very difficult to teach the complexities of the narrative all the time from scratch in a period of one semester. So what I have done is that before at the beginning, I used to teach more like a survey class. Oh, let's see different genres. But that becomes too spread out, I think, for the students sometimes. Because if, for example, you do superheroes one week and the second one you do horror and the third one you do a biography, sometimes for them it's too chaotic. So what I have done is that I created a framework that is easier for them. So that's why I transform my class into superhero parodies, because that way it limits the narrative to one genre, but then at the same time, I'm able to juxtapose the American influence with how the Hispanic Latinx culture portrays itself. So then in a process of 12 weeks, which is limited time, I think I can go faster with them because I'm saying, okay, look at the infrastructure that is created by the US as a global power, but then let's see how the other countries react to that. And therefore we are able to tackle stuff about race, gender, etc. So for example, in that class, when I do indigenous communities, I say, okay, these 4 weeks we're doing indigenous comics about indigenous heroes that are superheroes, and therefore we'll compare in relation to the US. So then, we do Super Cholo from Peru, we do Touré from Puerto Rico, and other characters from Mexico, etc. And that way, there is like an infrastructure so that then they can communicate, oh, look at these different Hispanic states, and then let's see how it compares to the US, etc. So that's how I can create like a sense of structure. But I think at this point, the students, we want to explain to them the aesthetic part, like how the comic book function, but they're very hungry about getting more knowledge about diversity.
Yeah, really great.
Like the students want to know that more. And so for them, when I do something comparative like that, like for them, it's interesting to see, okay, how do we treat indigenous communities in the US as opposed to Latin America? And what do they mean for their nationalism? So that for them is the main knowledge that they want to get. And then hopefully they'll read more, but to me, I guess it's my comparative background. I kind of like try to create like an infrastructure, but not to be essential. It's more like to see connections and differences. Like, why is it different here from the other?
Man, I wish I could. I wish I were up there in Middlebury taking a class with you, Enrique. What are obviously the Taíno work and comics is like really central to everything that you're focusing on when you're not chairing the department and teaching. Do you want to tell us a little more about that? Other projects you're working on?
Well, I have several projects. The first one is the one about Puerto Rico and the role of Puerto Rico in the superhero genre. And the reason I wanted to write this book is because sometimes the Caribbean is associated with music, which goes, which is great. Like I love the Caribbean music. I actually teach it and I want to write more about it. But sometimes we are not associated with how we contribute to the American narratives. And so what I discover in my research is that first there are the Puerto Rican comics in the island, and then the Puerto Rican comics in the US. But the problem is that the Puerto Rican people assume that an ethnic narrative, it means that it has to be about your identity. See what I mean? But the Puerto Ricans have worked in all the white American superheroes and they have helped develop the genre. So my question here is when you talk about Puerto Rico and the role in the superhero genre, does that mean only Puerto Rican heroes or does that mean white American heroes? And so, for example, you get someone like George Perez that practically did the Infinity Gauntlet that has been adapted now in the Avengers Infinity War. He did Wonder Woman, which the movie took some stuff from his comics. He did Teen Titans that now has been adapted in cartoons and in the live action TV show. But nobody ever thinks of a Puerto Rican creator affecting these Anglophone narratives. So they only think about them if they created actually a Puerto Rican superhero, which he did with the White Tiger. But they have been working in that. So for example, when I was in my university in Puerto Rico, one of the students that was there at the time when I was studying, his name is Kenneth Rocafort. I don't know if you have heard of him. So Kenneth Rocafort, his father was a professor, and he is now one of the top artists at DC, and he draws Superman but nobody sees that as a Puerto Rican art. They just see him as work for hire for the Anglophone audience. But to me, we should recognize too, not only the Puerto Rican characters, but also how they work on the genre itself. And so to me, that's something that could be important to question, which is the idea, what is the ethnic narrative? Is it about the theme, or is it about how they affect the mainstream in a way?
Wow. Yeah, amazing.
And so, like I said before, I noticed that a lot of them drew African American comic books, and they drew Native American comic books. There is this guy that recently died, Ernie Colon. He created Amethyst, the DC princess of the gem world, and she's a blonde character, so maybe people don't see it as a Puerto Rican thing, but he actually developed the character, and right now I think it's been published a new series in DC Comics, so his legacy is there. So that type of thing is what I want to explore in the book. Is like, say, look, all these people have been working in the industry and their characters are still there. It's just that you don't see them as Puerto Rican because they are not Puerto Rican in the plot.
Yeah, that work is so important. I know that people have been doing that with Disney as well, not just with the women, right, who colored all of those, hand colored all of the animation, right? But really excavating and archiving and understanding how some of our biggest industries have been shaped by folks of color, by women, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, really important, Enrique.
And one of the things that I want to explore is that doesn't mean that their work cannot be problematic, because, for example, one of the artists that I'm also studying, his name is Ruben Moreira, and he was working in the Golden Age. And when you read his comics, he's drawing for American writers, and of course he has like all this exotic stuff about South America, adventures in Africa, and so some of the new Puerto Rican artists have been involved in some of the Orientalist narratives in superhero comic books. For example, I don't know if you know Tony Daniel. He drew for Grant Morrison like this extravagant Ra's al Ghul Batman story. So I could totally see some people having issues with that type of Orientalist narrative, and so that's what I wanted to kind of like describe, like how working in the American industry means you could be subversive. You could also write, like narratives that fit the mainstream that are written by the people in power. So just because you are POC doesn't mean that you are political antagonist against the system all the time.
Mm-hmm. Like. Yeah, of course. Great. Enrique, where are you seeing the vitality in comics and comic studies today?
Well, I really think that at the beginning, it was important to develop the comic studies from an aesthetic perspective, because it was important to explore how comic books work as an art, which is why we had the Understanding Comics by MacLeod, that is like a genius piece of work. But I really think that at this moment, it has to be more about diversity. It has to be more about discovering how other narratives function. I somehow feel that in the US, the American industry and even academia at some point is still very marked by Marvel and DC in a way, and so, we should read more manga, we should read more, comics from Argentina, Europe, if we can. But the problem is limitations of language. Because I know Spanish, I can read the entire Latin America, but if they're not translated into the US, then that means people are more limited. So, for example, I can teach Latin America because I teach in Spanish, in the Uso Hispanic Studies, but if I was teaching a generic English class, it's possible that I may be limited to only a few things that have been translated. So there are some issues about translation going on. But in my book about Hernandez, the main thing that I feel is that diversity is not only about the process of inclusion, because that's how sometimes people dismiss it, like, oh, you just want to include people. But I think that diversity actually makes the comics better too, because it brings a fresh approach to what is happening. And so sometimes, as someone who has been reading superhero comic books since the 80s, sometimes I get tired of reading the same thing. And so sometimes bringing a character like Miles Morales or Miss Marvel, it brings a fresh perspective that makes me excited to buy comics again. And so I think that's what people don't understand sometimes, that you cannot be reading the same character from 50 years. You need to kind of like shift it. And so that's why I believe also in the process of diversity, besides inclusion, is like, it will make the comics better.
Absolutely. It does make the comics better. And the work that you're doing is really the kind of vital work in that space. I think, to be honest, Enrique, like you said, kind of moving away from kind of that phase where we were trying to define a field and then trying to define its language and how it functions, and then kind of splitting hairs about that. Finally, to the moment where we can write a book on the Bros Hernandez, we can write a book on Taíno and comics, LGBTQ comics, nonfiction comics, global comics, manga influence comics, Western manga comics. Yeah, I love it. I love it. And you're really at the avant-garde here, Enrique. Thank you, Enrique, for joining me and for telling the world why comics matter.
Okay, you're welcome. And thank you for inviting me.